Hello, my name is Liam, and in this video I'm going to give a brief summary of the exploratory paper Emergent Participation in DIY Designed Bike Trails, which will detail some early findings from research we've been doing with trail builders. First, I'd like to acknowledge the long history of traditional owners of the land around the Lehigh Valley in Pennsylvania, where parts of this research took place, and to acknowledge the ongoing colonial histories of the second research setting in Denmark and where I'm based in the UK. To give a very brief introduction to the research setting, trails for BMX and mountain bikes are dirt tracks and jumps designed, built and maintained by hand by small communities of trail builders. Many of them are built in secret, often on private land without prior permission from landowners, meaning they can be precarious, fragile and are often bulldozed and illegalised, much to the distress of the local builders. On the screen are two of the sites that I will mainly focus on in this paper. On the left is Posh Woods, that with its sister site Catty has been in Pennsylvania for around 25 years. And on the right is Holmendert, which has been just outside the anarchist commune Freetown, Christiania in Denmark since the late 1990s. Importantly, both of these spots are now legitimised and do not need to be kept secret. In looking at these spots, I will draw on scholarship on the commons to describe the kinds of participation they are the upshot of. And this will provide three key takeaways. One, that end users of the space already have a direct influence on its implementation and use, offering an interesting and novel setting for PD to learn from. Two, that some forms of participation are severely constrained due to the spot's illegal and fragile status, which reminds us that participation, or perhaps the wrong kinds of participation, can also be a threat to certain communities. And three, that as some spots change in legal and political status, locals have begun to develop ways of increasing participation by adjusting the architecture of the space, as well as developing new practices, and in our view becoming emergent participatory designers. So part 1, non-participation in the uncommons. As alluded to in the introduction, the notion of the commons helps us to think of these spaces in the ways they emerge from DIY self-determined communities by using appropriated land. But as Brian from Posh sets out below, participation in the commons of trail spots has been highly policed. He told me, you didn't go down there unless you knew somebody or you got the okay from somebody. The local builders at Posh have in the past sought to exclude users from outside the core local community, often by way of intimidation, as well as keeping them secret and hidden. However, Carly, who we'll later find out was one of those excluded by these practices, offered some nuance to this and could sympathise with the protectionism. She says, when trails get ploughed, people's lives stop for a long time. Something died. They lost something that they invested so much into. When people are so protective of trails and people coming in, it's because of that experience of loss. So the problem that Carly describes is that too much participation could potentially bring unwanted attention and jeopardise the future of the spot. These practices of exclusion begin to echo Garrett Hardin's famous The Tragedy of the Commons, which is often cited as a precursor to neoliberal politics, who argues that the protection of private property and the enclosure of commons is in the best interests of the population. But one of the problems with this definition is that commons are not only a set of collective resources, but ongoing formations of relations by a community that almost always involve some sort of governance. Meaning, though the commons are technically open, there are always certain rules to be adhered to, for example, so that the land would not be overwhelmed. So the commons in this case is being actively produced on appropriated land by the community that is semi-open but requires adherence to certain behaviours. But there are clearly some problems with the kinds of exclusion that Brian described before. The spaces are often dominated by white cisgender men who have historically excluded women. For example, Carly told me a story of going to Posh Woods in the early days, saying, I went with my brother, I had no intentions of riding, but I bought my bike because we were on a trip, and the locals all looked at me like, why is she here? This echoes other scholarship in punk and DIY. For example, the skateboarding scholar Dari Abu-Alahawa has explained that calls to maintain the sport's core values has largely been about ensuring that legitimate skateboarders, which typically refers to a predominantly white male positionality, are able to maintain control over skateboarding culture. Therefore, these spaces provide a thorny discussion point whereby participation is viewed as potentially damaging, forcing us to consider the merits of exclusion and restriction, but at the same time to critique the ways it sits along dominant patriarchal lines. There are arguably several instances whereby exclusion is necessary in order to protect spaces, for example sacred or natural spaces, or perhaps to rewild damaged land. But in addition to this, in the trail building community, we can also see new initiatives that actively look to exclude to include. For example, women's and gender non-binary events, whereby underrepresented groups are centred, which we'll go on to further in the next section. So there's been something of a change of the guard in recent years, and interviewees have described a change whereby the communities are carefully developing ways to be inclusive toward a broader range of users. Part of this comes with a shift in the main locals. They perhaps get older or less able to ride, and are worried that the spot might die out. As Carly explained to me, there's this fear that there's going to be a disconnect, that when this group of legendary trail builders are all done, who's going to come up and take over the trails? So our interlocutors have gone on to describe actively organising and redesigning spots, jumps and lines so that it might become more open to new publics. And many of the locals have found that they need to involve different and more of the community so that the spaces themselves can be made sustainable. Brian described how there's been a shift where they're now trying to encourage people to join the spot so that it can be made more sustainable, saying, I think you've got to put the beacon out there. And we've been trying to do that and been making it more accessible and more inviting to younger people, to women, to girls. Beros from Holman Dirt explained that after much internal debate, they decided to form a union so that they could apply for funding from the local municipality in order to expand their spot and include more people by providing free access to bikes and maintenance equipment. He said, from the start, we didn't want to get picked up by the commune too much. But then, if we do it like that, you don't get to grow. You don't get to get really good facilities. It was hard for the community to resolve because you get different factions. You get a faction that want to keep it low, and then you have the faction with me where we wanted to go for the stars. He also explained that this led to tensions within the community whereby some felt that the punk and DIY roots of the space were being replaced with more mainstream administration and organisation. And in the immediate aftermath, many members of the community began to drop out. The Beros also explained that numbers have now increased from around 40 before the spot was legitimised to roughly 300 now. But of course, some exclusion is somewhat inevitably baked into the sport, because the architecture of the spaces, the jumps and features, so on, require certain skills and daringness to participate. Beros also explained to me how they have begun to adjust the architecture by building specific features in order to welcome a broader community. For example, they recently built a pump track deliberately positioned so that it is visible from a path running alongside the trails in a public park, in the hope that young people and parents will see it and want to get involved. This has shifted to not only staging events, but to redesigning the space then. Carly went on and suggested that it is important to build spots in a way that they can be perceived as welcoming and open to broad publics, suggesting if you make a spot that's public, I think the first thing you should see when you come in is a pump track, because you'll see parents riding with kids on striders on the same obstacle, and that's very comforting to anybody. There's no way they can hate that pump track. Similarly, at Posh, Brian explained that they have recently built a small and safe beginners line, and another local Taran recently built a line called the Secret Garden, where newer riders can practice without feeling that they are on show, to avoid the intimidating sense of performativity or feeling like they're being watched or judged by more experienced riders. So in the spirit of an exploratory paper, we come to a slightly unconventional conclusion, which hopefully points to opportunities for conversation at the conference. The first is to think about how to engage with trail spots symmetrically, where we can not only learn from them, but also find ways that PD could contribute to the local communities. Building on this, I find the notion of the uncommons could become a really helpful tool to understand how spaces such as woods and forests can become part of what Blaise de la Cadena call a more than human uncommons. Third, taking a capitalist realist approach to these spots, these spaces also suggest some ways that wildness could be supported and made politically and economically viable over other damaging practices such as agriculture or logging. And finally, we've also identified some other spaces where forms of emergent DIY participatory design may exist, and we're excited to think through the ways that the PDC community could continue to engage with these. Thank you very much for listening.